everyone. Welcome to this edition of WION-VOA Co-Production. I'm your host, Susan Tehrani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin with efforts across the United States to protect the right to vote this November. This comes as both major U.S. political parties are expressing concern about election integrity, meaning the process of voter registration, plus the counting, and certification of votes. More from VOA's chief national correspondent, Steve Herman, on Capitol Hill.
Democrats accuse Republicans of limiting access to polling stations and plotting to hamper the certification of the results. Republicans suspect Democratic Party operatives of tampering with absentee ballots, manipulating voting machines, and keeping ineligible voters on the rolls. The Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump, is facing criminal charges over his attempts to overturn his 2020 election loss.
I thought the election was a rigged election, a stolen election.
The Democratic Party's nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, accuses Trump of undermining confidence in elections while she pledges to uphold fundamental American principles.
From the rule of law to free and fair elections to the peaceful transfer of power.
Federal agencies have been conducting tabletop exercises mindful of January 6, 2021, when Trump supporters, unhappy with the president's defeat, stormed the U.S. Capitol. Has the preparation strengthened election integrity? That is the hope of stakeholders such as the 104-year-old League of Women Voters, whose chief executive officer is Selena Stewart.
That doesn't happen, but I guess it's a wait and see. We'll have to see what happens, what the outcome of the election is, how people feel about it, what protests, and whether that protest crosses the line into violence. And my hope is that it doesn't.
So far this year, the system has held up well, according to the chairman of the Federal Election Assistance Commission, Ben Hovland.
We've had a lot of primaries already, both the presidential primaries this year, but state primaries. And so election officials have had a lot of practice already this season, and I think we're in good shape going into November.
Election officials in Champaign County struggled to get results out last night.
In Champaign County in the state of Illinois, the local Republican Party in 2020 tried to have a judge compel the county clerk, Aaron Ammons, to stop counting mailed-in ballots.
And he dismissed that claim, and I was able to count the ballots. But they definitely tried it, just like they were trying in other places across the country.
Threats, intimidation, and lawsuits have prompted many election officials and volunteers nationwide to quit, according to Ammons.
It does a disservice, and it really is disheartening to the people who do this work if we're not getting the support that we obviously need for being on the front lines of democracy.
It is important to invite candidates, party officials, and the public to watch the system in operation, according to the Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri, Eric Fay.
Opening mail ballots, tabulating ballots, testing voting equipment, manually recounting, auditing after the election. All of these things are publicly observable.
Senate Republican leadership wants to pass legislation that would require people registering to vote to provide proof of citizenship. Most Democrats here on Capitol Hill argue that the law already makes it illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and there's no evidence to support claims that illegal immigrants in significant numbers are voting. Steve Herman, VOA News, on Capitol Hill.
Joining us now with additional reporting on voter interference is VOA's correspondent, Jessica Stone. She's live at the White House. Hi, Jessica. So Washington accused Russia this week of trying to interfere in the 2024 presidential election. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, it's happening on a couple of fronts. This week, the Justice Department charged 2 individuals, employees of Russia Today, which is Russian state media, of money laundering and acting as agents of a foreign government. The plot, they allege, is that they worked with a private company to create more than 24 internet domains at the direction of Moscow to spread propaganda and essentially leverage social media influencers to spread pro-Kremlin messages around the U.S. election. They are putting out a $10 million reward for the capture of those 2 individuals. Meantime, the U.S. Treasury Department is also sanctioning 10 people and 2 entities, making their assets subject to seizure. And the State Department is also issuing new limits on visas themselves. For its part, Moscow's spokesperson says the only winner of the U.S. election is the, quote, U.S. private military complex. Susan?
And also, Jessica, this action comes on the heels of efforts by the U.S. government to reassure voters that the presidential election will be safe. What did those efforts look like?
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations around that this week at the state level. Top election security official was actually on Capitol Hill as well from the cybersecurity agency, saying that there have been no attacks or hacking efforts on the systems to tally votes or to facilitate voting. But election officials have also been establishing and hiring more election officers and field offices, security advisors to be at polling locations in preparation for November. And election monitors are also working on increased intelligence sharing operations throughout the state and federal government at the local level as well. Right now, we understand that 97% of U.S. voters will cast ballots where there is a paper backup system, which would be an extra layer of security if there's any failure of the electronic means of tallying these votes, and they are not going to be connected to the internet. Right now, election officials cautioning against using social media or any other word-of-mouth sources of information as Americans go to the polls this November. And the Biden administration has requested additional funding ahead of the end of the fiscal year for election protections. They want Congress to commit to fund election security and the 2025 presidential transition, which would happen in the new year, especially if Capitol Hill cannot pass that budget during the fiscal year. As you know, we often come to the end of the calendar year and we're still reporting about efforts in Washington to pass the U.S. budget. The White House trying to get ahead of that so that there's a smooth presidential transition no matter who wins in November. Susan?
Okay, well, Jessica, thank you for that. Please do stay with us. I'd like to get your thoughts on our next story from your colleague, Anita Powell. Ukraine faces widely different prospects under potential Trump or a Harris presidency. But as their campaigns race to the finish line, neither candidate has laid out exactly how they plan to end the conflict. And experts say in that same space of time, the Ukrainian battlefield itself has radically changed, giving more power to Ukraine in determining its own fate. VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell reports from Washington.
Ukraine's ancient capital knows well what it's like to be tossed about by the waves and whims of powerful forces. And so analysts there seem ambivalent to a possible second term for former President Donald Trump.
There is a prevailing opinion that the return of Trump to the White House is not the best scenario for Ukraine, although there are also cautious opinions that everything may not be that bad.
Trump has said he will swiftly end the war, though his running mate, J.D. Vance, once said he doesn't really care about Ukraine, leaving Ukrainians unsure what to think. This makes a potential Kamala Harris presidency more of a wild card to this nation that knows Trump and President Joe Biden so well. Harris has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and represented Biden at major transatlantic security summits. But on the trail, Harris has only briefly spotlighted Ukraine and how she differs from Trump.
He encouraged Putin to invade our allies, said Russia could, quote, do whatever the hell they want. 5 days before Russia attacked Ukraine, I met with President Zelensky to warn him about Russia's plan to invade. I helped mobilize a global response over 50 countries to defend against Putin's aggression. And as president, I will stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies.
Analysts say Harris is likely to follow Biden's support Ukraine playbook, and Trump's broad foreign policy pronouncements remain as vague as ever. Take Trump's promise that he will end the war in one day.
It's not entirely clear how he'll do that. The fear, of course, is that he'll do it by simply abandoning Ukraine, cutting off funds and pressuring Zelensky into negotiations at a time when Putin would enjoy all of the bargaining leverage.
But he says the battlefield has shifted with Ukrainian forces' recent decision to strike across the border and take a bite of Russian territory. While analysts widely predict that Ukraine will neither seek nor succeed in holding this land, it's a bargaining chip that will help Kyiv whoever wins. And he said Biden could also put his hand on the scale at a pivotal stage.
I wouldn't be expecting any shift in the U.S. position vis-a-vis Ukraine's military operations before November, but I would be watching between November and January, whatever the outcome, to see if there is a little bit more leash given to Kyiv.
And he notes Ukraine's leader has bolstered his relationships with European leaders and broadened his support. And so, as these two race to the end of this story, what could end up happening in Ukraine ultimately may not be up to the American president, whoever she or he is. Anita Powell, VOA News, Washington.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still live with us. Jessica, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has long been asking Washington to provide long-range missiles that could reach into Russia. Where does that request stand as of now?
Well, it looks like it's moving forward quite a bit. In fact, Reuters reporting, according to U.S. officials, that Washington is, quote, close to giving Ukraine permission to use long-range missiles that could reach into Russia, as you said. Kyiv, though, would need to wait several months to work out some technical details because these weapons only work right now with U.S. designated aircraft. And as we've seen, the F-16s are in Ukraine, but they're new and they're still having some problems operating them there. The deal is expected to be announced this fall, according to the Reuters report. And these weapons, they are joint air to surface standoff missiles, so another kind of weapon that Ukraine has not yet received. They actually put 30 Russian bases in range, and they could push Russian forces further back, making it more difficult for them to make gains throughout the fall and winter months. Washington, though, has been reluctant to do this because they are concerned that this could escalate things. But of course, right now, there's no clear winner in this conflict, and we're getting into these winter months where the consequences to the population are much more dire. Susan?
And President Zelensky is expected to reshuffle his war cabinet ahead of his visit to the United States. What do American analysts read into this, if anything?
Yeah, it's a good question because this is the broadest shakeup that's happened since the war began over 2 years ago. And U.S. officials obviously pretty hesitant to weigh in on what this means. What Zelensky himself says this means is that he is trying to get new energy into the political establishment there in Ukraine at a time when they're under martial law. And so he remains at the top of the government, but they can't hold elections in the Ukraine right now. Ukraine's parliament this week accepting the resignation of the foreign minister, and the deputy foreign minister will now become the new acting foreign minister. 4 others resigning, including, very importantly, and I think you see video of him here, the leader of weapons production for Ukraine. So that's a key piece too. These positions are not filled now. It is the hope that they will become filled through this shakeup, and that will have an impact on how Ukraine continues to prosecute this war. Susan?
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of that. VOA's Jessica Stone joining us live from the White House. Have a great weekend, Jessica.
You bet.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.